I never thought a mailbox would be the thing that finally made me snap. But here we were in sunny Gilbert, Arizona, where the paint on my newly installed purple mailbox was still drying when I heard the sharp knock on my front door. The woman standing on my porch looked exactly like what you would imagine when someone says the words, HOA president. Her name was Patricia Hoffman, though everyone in the neighborhood called her Pat the Enforcer behind her back. She was in her early 50s with that particular haircut that seemed to be issued along with HOA board positions, holding a clipboard like it was a weapon, and wearing an expression that suggested my purple mailbox had personally insulted her entire family lineage. "Mr. Fitzgerald," she said, not bothering with pleasantries, "I'm sure you're aware that your mailbox is in direct violation of the Sunset Hills Home Owner Association Guidelines, Section 4, Subsection B, Paragraph 3. I leaned against my doorframe, still holding the coffee mug I had been enjoying just 30 seconds ago when life was peaceful. "Pat, I moved in 3 weeks ago. I haven't memorized the HOA Bible yet." Her jaw tightened. The guidelines clearly state that all mailboxes must be either black, white, or natural wood finish. Your purple mailbox is an eyesore and diminishes property values for the entire neighborhood. I looked past her at the offending mailbox. It was a beautiful shade of violet, the same color as the desert lupines that bloomed in the Arizona spring. My late grandmother had loved purple, and since I had just inherited enough money from her estate to finally buy a house, I figured a purple mailbox was a small tribute. Apparently, that was too much personality for Sunset Hills. "It's just a mailbox, Pat." "It's a violation," she corrected. "You have 72 hours to replace it with an approved color, or you'll receive a fine of $100 per day until compliance is achieved." She handed me an official-looking letter with the HOA letterhead and walked away, her sensible shoes clicking on my driveway like a judge's gavel. I stood there, looking at the letter, then at my mailbox, then back at the letter. $100 per day for a purple mailbox, in America, in 2025. This was real life. I should mention that I'm not typically a confrontational person. My name is Tyler Fitzgerald. I'm 32 years old, and I work remotely as a software developer. I chose Gilbert specifically because it seemed like a quiet place to settle down, away from the chaos of Phoenix proper. The house was perfect, a nice 3-bedroom ranch style with a decent backyard. And yeah, it was in an HOA community, but I figured how bad could it really be? Turns out, pretty bad. The next day, I did what any reasonable person would do. I read the HOA guidelines from cover to cover, all 47 pages of them. It was like reading a manual on how to live without any joy whatsoever. The rules covered everything from approved paint colors for houses to the exact height your grass could be, to what types of decorations were allowed during holidays. And yes, there it was, the mailbox rule. But here's the thing I noticed as I read through this document that Pat clearly thought was gospel. The rule about house colors was surprisingly vague. It stated that homes should be painted in earth tones that complement the desert landscape. It listed a few examples: beige, tan, terracotta, sage green, but it didn't have a complete list of forbidden colors. It just said earth tones. An idea started forming in my head. A petty, ridiculous, absolutely perfect idea. I called my buddy Marcus, who worked in interior design. "Hey, I need to know something. Is purple an earth tone?" "What kind of purple?" he asked. "Any purple. All purples." "I mean, technically, some purples could be considered earth tones. Lavender comes from a plant. There are purple minerals and stones. Purple exists in nature. Why?" "No reason," I said, though I was already pulling up paint suppliers on my computer. I spent the next 2 days researching. I looked up geology sites, color theory, and even consulted with a landscaper about what colors appear in the Arizona desert. Turns out, purple shows up more than you would think. Purple sage, purple hedgehog cacti, lupines, verbena, and various minerals in the rock formations around the state. I documented everything. On the third day, right before my 72 hours were up, I called a painting company. "I need my entire house painted," I told them. "How fast can you do it? Depends on the size and the weather. For a standard ranch home, probably 4 or 5 days if we put a full crew on it. I need it done in 3 days. I'll pay double." The owner of the company, a guy named Robert Chen, came out to look at the house that afternoon. He walked around the property, taking measurements and photos. "This is definitely doable with the right crew. What color are we talking about?" I showed him the paint sample I had picked out. It was called Desert Twilight, a gorgeous medium purple with subtle gray undertones. Coincidentally, it was manufactured by a company that specifically marketed southwestern desert-inspired colors. Robert raised his eyebrows. "That's bold. Can you do it? For double the rate?" "I can paint it rainbow if you want, but are you sure about this? I mean, I'm not trying to talk myself out of a job, but that's a big commitment to purple." "I'm sure," I said, thinking about Pat's face when she handed me that violation letter. "I'm very sure." We shook hands, and he said his crew would start the next morning. I went inside and drafted a letter to the HOA, explaining that I would not be changing my mailbox as it matched my new house color scheme, which complied with the stated guidelines about earth tones. I attached my research about purple in the natural desert environment, included photos of local purple flora and geological formations, and submitted it through their online portal. Then I went outside and just stared at my purple mailbox, imagining the entire house matching it. Maybe this was crazy. Maybe I was about to make a huge mistake. Maybe I should just buy a black mailbox and move on with my life like a normal person. But you know what? I was tired of people like Pat making up arbitrary rules and expecting everyone to just fall in line. This was my house. I had worked hard for it. My grandmother would have loved this. The next morning at 7 sharp, Robert's crew showed up with ladders, tarps, and about 50 gallons of Desert Twilight purple paint. My neighbors started coming out of their houses almost immediately. The first to approach was an older man named George Templeton who lived 3 houses down. "Son," he said, looking at the paint cans, "is that what I think it is? If you think it's purple paint for my house, then yes." George started laughing. Not a polite chuckle, but a full belly laugh. "Patricia is going to lose her mind. That's kind of the point." "Good," he said, surprising me. "Someone needs to stand up to her. Last year she fined me $2,000 because I planted tomatoes in my front yard. Tomatoes, said they weren't aesthetically pleasing. I had to take her to arbitration just to get the fine reduced. Another neighbor, a young woman named Sarah Brighton who lived next door, came over with her coffee. "Is this about the mailbox?" Word traveled fast apparently. "Yeah, I love it," she said. "She tried to fine me when my daughter drew on our driveway with chalk. Said it was visual pollution. She's terrible." Throughout the morning, I learned that pretty much everyone in Sunset Hills had a Pat story. She had fined the Hendersons for having their garage door open for more than 30 minutes while they unloaded groceries. She had reported the Martinez family for having too many cars in their driveway when relatives visited for Thanksgiving. She had threatened the Johnsons with legal action because their dog barked during approved quiet hours. The woman was a tyrant with a clipboard and too much free time. By noon, the first coat was going up, and my house was already looking distinctly purple. I sat on my porch, drinking lemonade and watching the transformation. A few people slowed down as they drove past, doing double takes. One person stopped and took a picture. At 2:30, Pat's silver sedan pulled up in front of my house going about 15 miles per hour faster than the neighborhood speed limit. She got out of her car like a gunfighter in an old western, her sensible purse swinging like a holster. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded, marching up my driveway. "Painting my house," I said calmly, "as is my right as a homeowner. That color is absolutely not approved. Actually, according to Section 7, subsection C of the guidelines, houses should be painted in earth tones that complement the desert landscape. This is desert twilight, specifically designed to reflect the colors of the Arizona desert sky. Purple appears throughout our local ecosystem in various plants and minerals. I submitted a full report with my documentation." Her face was turning an interesting shade of red that definitely wasn't an earth tone. "That's not what the rule means, and you know it." "Then maybe the rule should be more specific," I said. "As written, I'm in compliance." "I'll have you in front of the board so fast it will make your head spin. We'll fine you until you can't afford to keep this house." "You're welcome to try," I said. "I look forward to the meeting." She stood there, practically vibrating with anger, before spinning around and stomping back to her car. She peeled out, which was definitely a violation of the neighborhood's safe driving guidelines, but I wasn't going to be the one to report it. George walked over, still grinning. "That was beautiful. I haven't seen her that mad since someone put a flamingo lawn ornament out as a joke." "What happened to the flamingo?" "She confiscated it in the middle of the night. The homeowner found a violation notice in its place. We're pretty sure she has a storage unit full of confiscated decorations somewhere." The painting continued over the next 3 days. The crew was efficient and professional, and Robert kept me updated on their progress. By day 2, both coats were complete on 3 sides of the house. By day 3, the entire house was a glorious shade of purple, looking like something out of a desert dream. I had to admit, it was striking. It definitely stood out from the sea of beige and tan houses around it, but it wasn't ugly. It actually looked kind of amazing, especially during sunset when the purple seemed to glow against the pink and orange sky. My phone started ringing constantly. Friends who had heard about my purple rebellion called to either encourage me or question my sanity. My mom called from Oregon, confused about why her son was involved in what she called a paint-based protest. "It's the principle, Mom," I explained. "Tyler, honey, sometimes you have to pick your battles." "I am picking my battles. This is the one I'm picking." She sighed. "You're just like your grandmother, stubborn as a mule when you think something is unfair." I took that as a compliment. The HOA board meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday evening at the community center. I spent the time preparing my case like I was going to court. I printed out copies of the guidelines, highlighted the relevant sections, prepared my documentation about purple in nature, and even got a written statement from the paint company confirming that Desert Twilight was part of their Southwestern Earth Tone collection. I also did some research into HOA law in Arizona. Turns out, HOAs have a lot of power, but they're not unlimited. They have to follow their own rules, and those rules have to be reasonable and applied fairly. If they started changing interpretations of rules on the fly just to target specific homeowners, that could be considered selective enforcement, which is illegal. I also found out something interesting about Pat. She had been HOA president for 8 years, which seemed like a long time for what was supposed to be a volunteer position. I dug a little deeper and discovered that she actually received a stipend for her work as president. It wasn't technically a salary, but it was a monthly payment of $1,500 for administrative duties. That caught my attention. I started looking into the HOA finances, which by law had to be available to homeowners. It took a few days and several emails to the HOA treasurer, a nervous man named Kevin Chen, who was Robert the painter's brother. But I eventually got access to the financial reports for the last 3 years. What I found was interesting. The HOA collected about $300 per month from each of the 200 homes in Sunset Hills. That was $60,000 a month, or $720,000 a year. The expenses were listed as landscaping for common areas, insurance, maintenance, and administrative costs. But when I added up all the documented expenses, they came to only about $500,000 a year. Where was the other $200,000 going? I made a note to bring this up if things got nasty at the meeting. Thursday evening came, and I dressed in business casual, wanting to look professional. I gathered my documents, put them in a folder, and drove to the community center. The parking lot was surprisingly full. Apparently, word had gotten around about the Purple House, and people wanted to see how this would play out. The meeting room was set up with a long table at the front where the board members sat, and rows of chairs for residents. Pat sat in the middle of the table, with 4 other board members flanking her. I recognized Kevin, the treasurer, a woman named Barbara Mills, who was the secretary, and 2 other members whose names I didn't know. At least 40 residents had shown up, which was apparently unusual. Most HOA meetings had about 5 attendees, unless there was something interesting happening. Tonight qualified as interesting. Pat called the meeting to order with a sharp rap of her gavel. They went through standard business first, approving minutes from the last meeting, discussing a proposal to repaint the community center, and debating whether to replace some aging playground equipment. Then Pat's expression hardened. "Now we come to new business," she said. "Specifically, a flagrant violation of our community standards by a resident who has painted his house in a completely inappropriate color." "I'd like to speak to that," I said, standing up. "You'll have your chance after the board discusses the matter." "Actually," I said, keeping my voice calm, "according to Arizona Revised Statutes Section 33-17-9, a homeowner must be given the opportunity to be heard before any fines or penalties are imposed by an HOA. I'd like that opportunity now." Pat's jaw clenched, but she nodded. "Fine. You have 5 minutes." I walked to the front and distributed copies of my prepared statement to each board member, along with my supporting documentation. Then I addressed the room. 3 weeks ago, I moved into Sunset Hills. I installed a purple mailbox as a tribute to my late grandmother, who raised me and recently passed away. Instead of a friendly welcome to the neighborhood, I received a violation notice threatening me with $100 daily fines. When I reviewed the HOA guidelines, I noticed that the rules about house colors are vague. They require earth tones that complement the desert landscape, but don't provide an exhaustive list of approved colors. I gestured to my documentation. Purple is absolutely an earth tone found in our desert environment. I've provided photos of local purple flora and geological formations. The paint I chose, Desert Twilight, is specifically marketed as a southwestern desert color. I've complied with the letter of the guidelines as written. Pat interrupted. "The spirit of the rule clearly implies neutral colors like beige and tan." "Does it?" I asked. "Because I see several houses in this neighborhood with sage green paint, which is just as bold as purple. I see houses with terracotta, which is literally red-orange." "How is purple less of an earth tone than red-orange?" A murmur went through the crowd. Several people nodded. "Furthermore," I continued, "I'd like to discuss selective enforcement. Mrs. Hoffman, you've been HOA president for 8 years. During that time, how many houses have been repainted in colors that weren't explicitly pre-approved, Pat shifted uncomfortably. I don't have those numbers memorized. I do, I said. I did some research. In the last 8 years, 17 houses have been repainted. Of those, 12 were in colors that weren't specifically listed in the guidelines, including 2 in sage green, 1 in pale blue, 1 in lavender, actually, and 1 in what I'd call gray purple. None of those homeowners were fined or threatened. Why am I being treated differently? The room was completely silent now. Pat's face was getting that red color again. If the board wants to enforce a stricter interpretation of the color guidelines going forward, that's their right, I said. But that requires officially amending the guidelines through proper procedures, including homeowner input and a vote. You can't just arbitrarily decide my house violates rules that other houses have already broken without consequence. That's textbook selective enforcement, and it's illegal under Arizona HOA law. I let that sink in for a moment before continuing. I'm not trying to cause problems. I'm just asking to be treated the same as everyone else in this community. If purple is unacceptable, then let's revise the guidelines to say so clearly, and let's apply that rule to everyone equally, including the house with lavender paint on Mesquite Drive. I sat down. The room erupted in conversation. People were talking to their neighbors, some agreeing with me, some debating. One of the other board members, a man with gray hair, leaned over to talk to Pat. Pat banged her gavel. "Order! We'll take this under advisement and schedule a follow-up meeting to discuss potential guideline amendments." "What about the fines?" I asked. "Those are suspended pending our review," she said tightly. George stood up from the audience. "While we're on the subject of enforcement, I'd like to know why some of us get fined for minor issues while others seem to get warnings or no consequences at all. How do you decide who to target?" That opened the floodgates. Other residents started standing up, sharing their stories about unfair fines and aggressive enforcement. Pat tried to maintain control, but the meeting devolved into a general complaint session about HOA overreach. Finally, a woman I didn't know stood up and said, "I move for a vote of no confidence in the current board leadership." "That's not on the agenda," Pat said quickly. "I don't care," the woman responded. "I've lived here for 15 years and I'm sick of this hostile environment. We're supposed to be a community, not a dictatorship." The room erupted in applause. Pat looked like she wanted to crawl under the table. Kevin, the treasurer, cleared his throat. "Actually, any homeowner can call for a special election with a petition signed by 20% of residents. That's in our bylaws." "Fine," the woman said. "I'll start a petition tonight." The meeting ended shortly after that, with Pat retreating quickly and the rest of the board looking shell-shocked. I gathered my materials and headed out, feeling a mix of triumph and exhaustion. George caught up with me in the parking lot. "You really stirred things up in there." "I didn't mean to start a revolution," I said. "I just wanted to keep my mailbox." "Sometimes revolutions start with mailboxes," he said, grinning. "Keep an eye out. Pat doesn't lose gracefully." He was right about that. Over the next few days, I started noticing Pat's car driving past my house more frequently than normal. Then I got a violation notice for having my trash cans visible from the street, even though it was trash day and everyone's cans were out. Then another violation for having a package on my porch for more than 24 hours. Then another for my grass being a 1/4 inch too long. She was harassing me, pure and simple. But every violation she sent, I documented. I took photos with timestamps, measured my grass, showed that the package had only been there for 18 hours, and kept records of everything. Meanwhile, the petition for a special election was gaining signatures fast. The woman who had started it, whose name was Rachel Foster, set up a table at the community center and caught people as they came and went. Within a week, she had signatures from 60% of the neighborhood. I also kept digging into the HOA finances. Something about those missing funds bothered me. I reached out to Kevin directly, asking for more detailed breakdowns of the administrative costs. He seemed nervous but provided what I asked for. That's when I found it. The administrative costs included Pat's monthly stipend, but they also included regular payments to a company called Sunset Property Management LLC for consulting services. These payments ranged from $5,000 to $10,000 per month, and they'd been going on for years. I looked up Sunset Property Management LLC with the Arizona Corporation Commission. The company was registered to one Patricia Hoffman. She had created a company and was paying herself consulting fees from HOA funds. That was embezzlement. That was a crime. I sat at my kitchen table, looking at the financial documents spread out before me, and realized this had just gotten a lot more serious than a purple mailbox. I needed to be careful about how I handled this. I called a lawyer the next morning. Her name was Diane Morris, and she specialized in HOA disputes and real estate law. I explained the situation, sent her the financial documents, and asked her opinion. "This is definitely concerning," she said after reviewing everything. "If she's paying herself from HOA funds without proper authorization or disclosure, that's misappropriation at minimum, potentially embezzlement if she's intentionally hiding it. Have other board members approved these payments? I don't know. The financial reports show them as line items, but I don't know if the board voted on them specifically. I need to look at the meeting minutes for the last few years. Can you get those?" I contacted Kevin again, and he sent over digital copies of all the meeting minutes. Deanne spent a day reviewing them and called me back. "Tyler, there's no record of the board ever voting to approve these consulting fees. They're just buried in the financial reports as administrative costs. If the other board members didn't know about them, Pat has been stealing from the HOA. If they did know and didn't tell the homeowners, they're all complicit. What do I do? You bring this to the attention of the entire board and the homeowners. If they don't take action, you file a complaint with the Arizona Attorney General's office." The AG takes HOA fraud seriously because it affects so many people. I thanked her and started preparing another report. This one was harder to compile because I wanted to be absolutely sure of my facts before I accused anyone of a crime. I cross-referenced every payment, checked bank statements that were part of the financial reports, and built a timeline of when the payments started and how they'd increased over time. It turned out Pat had been paying herself through her fake consulting company for 6 years, and the total amount was staggering. Over $300,000 of homeowner money had gone into her pocket. The special election meeting was scheduled for a Saturday morning. Rachel had collected enough signatures to force the vote, and the bylaws required it to happen within 30 days of a valid petition. The community center was packed. Every seat was filled and people were standing along the walls. Pat was at the front table again, but she looked different. Less confident. She knew something was coming. Rachel presented the petition and explained the process. There would be nominations for new board positions, followed by speeches from candidates, and then a vote. Several people were nominated, including Rachel herself, George, and a few others who were well respected in the community. Then I raised my hand. "Before we proceed with the election, I have information that I believe the homeowners need to hear. It concerns potential financial misconduct by the current board leadership." The room went completely silent. Pat's face went pale. I stood and distributed copies of my financial analysis to everyone in the room. Then I explained what I'd found, walking through the timeline of payments, showing how they were buried in administrative costs, and revealing that Sunset Property Management LLC was owned by Pat. Over the last 6 years, Patricia Hoffman has paid herself more than $300,000 in unauthorized consulting fees from HOA funds. There's no record of the board voting to approve these payments, and they were never disclosed to homeowners as required by Arizona law. The room erupted. People were shouting, some in anger, some in disbelief. Pat tried to speak but couldn't be heard over the chaos. Kevin stood up, his hands shaking. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. She told me those were payments for legal services and vendor management. I never looked into the company name." Barbara, the secretary, looked stunned. "I had no idea. I just took minutes. I didn't pay attention to the detailed finances." Pat finally found her voice. "This is a misunderstanding. Those were legitimate consulting fees for work I did, managing vendors and handling legal issues for the HOA." "Then, where are the contracts?" I asked. "Where are the invoices detailing what services you provided? Where are the board votes authorizing these payments?" "Because I've reviewed 6 years of meeting minutes and there's no record of any of it." She couldn't answer. She just sat there looking trapped. George stood up. "I'm calling the police. This is theft." "Now wait," Pat said, standing quickly. "There's no need for that. If there's been some accounting confusion, we can sort it out internally." $300,000 isn't confusion, Rachel said. "That's a crime." Someone had already called 911. Within 10 minutes, 2 Gilbert police officers arrived at the community center. The meeting had devolved into complete chaos by then, with some people defending Pat and others demanding her immediate arrest. The officers talked to me first since I was the one who had discovered the financial discrepancies. I showed them my documentation, explained the timeline, and gave them Deanne's contact information. They took statements from Kevin and Barbara. Then they talked to Pat. She tried to maintain her innocence, claiming everything was legitimate and properly authorized. But when the officers asked to see contracts or board approvals, she couldn't produce them. "Madam, we're going to need you to come down to the station to answer some questions," one of the officers said. "Am I under arrest?" Pat asked, her voice shaking. "Not at this time, but we're investigating allegations of embezzlement and fraud. You can come voluntarily, or we can obtain a warrant." Pat looked around the room at all the people she'd fined and harassed over the years. Nobody was coming to her defense. She gathered her purse and followed the officers out of the community center. The room was silent after she left. Then Rachel spoke up. "I think we still need to have this election. We need new leadership and we need to fix the damage that's been done." The election proceeded. Rachel was voted in as the new president. George became vice president. New members were elected to fill the other positions, including a retired accountant named Helen Foster, who promised to audit the HOA finances thoroughly. In the weeks that followed, things moved quickly. The police investigation confirmed what I'd found. Pat had been embezzling HOA funds for years. The Arizona Attorney General's office got involved because it fell under their jurisdiction for HOA fraud. Pat was formally charged with theft, fraud, and multiple counts of embezzlement. She tried to negotiate a plea deal, offering to pay back the money, but the AG's office wasn't interested. They wanted to make an example of her because HOA fraud had become such a problem in Arizona. The case went to trial 4 months later. I had to testify, walking the jury through the financial documents and explaining how I discovered the fraud. It wasn't fun. Pat's lawyer tried to paint me as someone with a vendetta over a mailbox, But the numbers didn't lie. Pat was convicted on all counts. The judge sentenced her to 5 years in prison and ordered her to pay full restitution plus penalties. The HOA would eventually get most of the money back, though it would take time to collect from Pat's assets. Meanwhile, life in Sunset Hills improved dramatically. The new board conducted the promised audit and found even more questionable expenses that Pat had hidden. They revised the HOA guidelines to be clearer and more reasonable, removing some of the more absurd rules and creating an appeals process for violations. They also updated the color guidelines. After much debate, they decided to allow any color that appeared naturally in the Arizona desert landscape, with examples including various purples, blues, greens, and warm tones. Several other houses were painted in non-traditional colors over the following months, and the neighborhood actually looked more interesting for it. My purple house became something of a landmark. People would give directions based on it. Turn left at the purple house on Saguaro Drive. Real estate agents marketed it as being in that friendly neighborhood with the purple house. Property values didn't decrease like Pat had predicted. If anything, they increased slightly because people liked living in a community that wasn't run by a tyrant. The mailbox, of course, stayed purple. Nobody bothered me about it again. George and I became good friends. He liked to joke that I'd accidentally become a neighborhood hero by being stubborn about a mailbox. Sarah from next door said her daughter drew purple houses now in all her pictures because she thought mine was so pretty. About 8 months after everything went down, I was sitting on my porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of purple and orange that perfectly complemented my house when Rachel stopped by. "Got a minute?" she asked. "Sure. Want some lemonade?" She sat down in the chair next to me. "I wanted to thank you again. I know things got way more complicated than you probably wanted when you just wanted to keep your mailbox." "Yeah, it definitely escalated," I admitted, "but I'm glad it worked out. We're thinking about installing a little plaque at the community center," she said. "Something about standing up for what's right and community accountability. Would you be okay with that? That seems like overkill for a mailbox dispute that spiraled out of control." She laughed. "Maybe, but you exposed fraud that had been going on for years. You saved this neighborhood a lot of money and got rid of someone who was making everyone miserable. That deserves recognition." I thought about it. "Okay, but no plaque with my name on it. If you want to do something, make it about the whole community. About how we're all responsible for keeping our neighborhood accountable and fair." "Deal," she said. We sat there for a while, watching the sky change colors. The neighborhood was quieter now, more peaceful. People weren't constantly worried about arbitrary fines or surprise violations. Kids played in their yards without fear that their chalk drawings would result in penalties. Neighbors helped each other instead of reporting each other. It was what a community should be. My phone buzzed with a text from my mom. "Saw the news article about the conviction. Your grandmother would be proud of you, even if your methods were unconventional. That purple house is perfect." I smiled. Yeah, Grandma would have loved this story. She was always the one who taught me to stand up for what was right, even when it was difficult or uncomfortable. She never backed down from bullies, and she never let anyone tell her she couldn't do something just because it wasn't traditional. A purple mailbox seemed like a small hill to die on, but sometimes small hills lead to discovering mountains. If I had just changed my mailbox to black like Pat demanded, she would have continued embezzling money and terrorizing the neighborhood. Sometimes being stubborn about the little things helps you find the big things that really matter. Kevin stopped by the next day with a bottle of wine. "Peace offering," he said. "I feel terrible that I didn't catch what Pat was doing. I should have looked closer at those finances. You trusted someone you thought was working for the community's benefit, I said. That's not a character flaw. Still, he said, I was the treasurer. It was my job to know where the money was going. We opened the wine and sat in my backyard. You know what the ironic thing is, Kevin said. Pat genuinely believed she was doing good work for the HOA. In her mind, all those fines and rules were making the neighborhood better. She thought she deserved that extra money because she was working so hard to maintain standards. That doesn't justify stealing $300,000. No, it doesn't, he agreed. But it's a good lesson about how people can rationalize anything if they believe they're the heroes of their own story. She convinced herself that she was the only thing standing between Sunset Hills and chaos. When really she was the chaos, I said. Exactly. We talked about the new board's plans for the neighborhood. They were going to use some of the recovered funds to upgrade the community amenities, add better lighting on the walking paths, and create a community garden where people could grow vegetables without fear of fines. There was talk of organizing neighborhood events, like movie nights in the park and holiday celebrations. It felt like the neighborhood was waking up after years of being suppressed. A few weeks later, I got a letter from Pat's lawyer. She was appealing her conviction and wanted me to know that she felt I had maliciously targeted her because of my illegal purple house. The letter suggested I should feel guilty for destroying a woman's life over a petty dispute. I showed the letter to Deanne, my lawyer. She read it and shook her head. This is absurd. She's still not taking responsibility. Don't respond to this. Let her waste her money on appeals. The conviction will stand. Does she really think she's the victim here? Some people are incapable of seeing themselves as anything but victims, Deanne said. She had power, she abused it, and she got caught. But in her mind, you're the villain who ruined everything by refusing to follow her rules. The appeals went nowhere. The evidence was too clear, and the conviction was solid. Pat served her time, and eventually, the HOA recovered most of the stolen money through the seizure of her assets, including her house, which ironically was painted beige. Life moved on. I settled into my routine, working from home and enjoying my purple house. I even started dating someone I met at one of the new community events. Her name was Deanna Martin, and she thought the whole Purple House story was hilarious. So you really painted your entire house purple because of a mailbox? She asked on our third date. Technically, I painted it purple because the HOA guidelines were vague and allowed for it, and I wanted to make a point about arbitrary enforcement of rules. Uh-huh. You painted your house purple because you were mad about a mailbox. Well, when you put it that way, she laughed. I love it. It's the most elaborate act of petty revenge I've ever heard of. It wasn't revenge, I protested. It was principled civil disobedience. Sure it was. A year after everything happened, the neighborhood held an anniversary celebration of what people were jokingly calling the Purple Revolution. They set up tables in the community center, had food trucks come in, and organized games for kids. It was cheesy, but it was also kind of nice. Rachel gave a speech about community responsibility and how one person standing up for what's right can inspire others to do the same. George made a joke about purple being the official color of freedom. Everyone laughed and cheered. I stayed in the background mostly, uncomfortable with being the center of attention. But people kept coming up to thank me, sharing their own stories about how the neighborhood had improved since the leadership changed. One elderly woman named Margaret Russo grabbed my hand and said, "My grandson is autistic, and he likes to line up his toy cars in the driveway. Pat used to find me constantly, saying it was visual clutter. Now he can play in peace. Thank you for that." That hit me harder than I expected. I hadn't really thought about all the small ways Pat's tyranny had affected people's daily lives. It wasn't just about money or arbitrary rules. It was about people feeling safe and comfortable in their own homes. Diana squeezed my hand. "You did a good thing," she said quietly. "I painted a house purple. You did more than that, and you know it." "Yeah, I guess I did. The funny thing about the whole situation is that it started with me just wanting to honor my grandmother with a simple purple mailbox. I wasn't trying to expose fraud or start a community revolution. I just wanted to be left alone to live in my house in peace. But sometimes life pushes you into situations where you have to decide whether to stand up or back down. And sometimes standing up for something small leads to uncovering something much bigger. My grandmother used to say that bullies only have power if good people are too tired to fight back. Pat had been counting on people being too tired, too busy, too intimidated to question her authority. She was wrong. The neighborhood is different now. Better. People look out for each other instead of reporting each other. The new board works with residents instead of against them. There are still rules because we need some structure, but they are reasonable rules enforced fairly. And yeah, my house is still purple. Beautifully, gloriously, unapologetically purple. I was working from home one afternoon, about 18 months after the whole incident, when someone knocked on my door. It was a young couple, probably in their late 20s, standing on my porch looking nervous. "Hi," the woman said. "I'm Amanda, and this is my husband Jake. We're thinking about buying a house in this neighborhood, and our real estate agent pointed out your house. We wanted to know if it's okay that we paint our house blue. We heard there was some kind of conflict about colors, and we just want to make sure we're not going to have problems." I invited them in and made coffee. Then I told them the whole story, from the purple mailbox to the embezzlement to the trial. They listened with increasingly wide eyes. "So," Jake said when I finished, "you accidentally exposed HOA fraud because you wanted a purple mailbox." "Pretty much, yeah." "That's insane," Amanda said, "but also kind of amazing." "The neighborhood is great now," I assured them. "The new board is reasonable. You can paint your house blue if you want. Just follow the actual guidelines. Treat your neighbors with respect and you'll be fine." They thanked me and left, still looking a bit stunned. Diana came over that evening and I told her about the couple. "You're becoming a legend," she teased. "The guy who took down a corrupt HOA with a purple mailbox. That's not how it happened. That's how everyone tells the story, though. You're like a folk hero. I just wanted to keep my mailbox and paint your house purple out of spite. It wasn't spite. It was strategic use of poorly written guidelines." She kissed me. "Whatever helps you sleep at night." 2 years after everything started, I was doing some maintenance on my mailbox, tightening the post because it had gotten loose, when a car pulled up. A woman in her 60s got out, looking at my house with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Can I help you?" I asked. "I'm Susan Hoffman," she said, "Patricia's sister." I straightened up, suddenly wary. "Okay." I wanted to meet the person who exposed what my sister was doing. "I've been trying to understand how she ended up where she is." "I'm sorry about what happened to your family," I said carefully, "but your sister stole a lot of money from a lot of people." "I know," Susan said, "and she deserved to face consequences. That's not why I'm here. I'm here because I wanted to thank you." That surprised me. "Thank me." Patricia has always had a problem with control and power. Our parents were very strict, very rigid, and she learned that love means rules and rules mean control. She spent her whole life trying to control everything around her, because that's the only way she feels safe. This was the first time anyone ever really stood up to her and made her face the consequences of her actions. "I didn't mean to destroy her life," I said. "You didn't." She destroyed her own life by making terrible choices. You just stopped her from destroying other people's lives in the process. She's getting help in prison, therapy, and counseling. For the first time, she's starting to see how her need for control hurt people. It's painful for our family, but it needed to happen. We talked for a few more minutes and then she left. I went inside feeling oddly emotional. I had tried not to think too much about Pat as a person, focusing instead on what she had done wrong. But she was a person, someone with her own pain and struggles. She had just made choices that hurt other people, and those choices had consequences. Life is complicated like that. Diana and I got engaged that fall. We decided to have the wedding at the community center, which seemed fitting given everything that had happened. The whole neighborhood was invited, and most people came. It was a big, chaotic, wonderful celebration. George gave a speech at the reception about how love and community both require standing up for what's right, even when it's uncomfortable. Rachel made a toast about how finding the right person means finding someone who supports you being your authentic self, even if that means painting your house purple. Everyone laughed and cheered. I looked around at all these people who had become my friends and my community, and I felt grateful for a purple mailbox and a stubborn grandmother who taught me not to back down from bullies. Deanna and I bought the house next to mine, which had gone up for sale. We knocked down the fence between the properties and created one big yard. She let me paint the new house purple too, matching the original. We called it the Purple Palace, much to the amusement of our neighbors. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm after that. I kept working remotely. Diana started a consulting business helping other HOAs implement better governance practices, and we both got involved in community activities. The neighborhood thrived under the new leadership, becoming a model for what HOAs could be when they focused on community building rather than rule enforcement. Sometimes I still think about that first violation notice, threatening me with daily fines over a mailbox. It seems absurd now, looking back, but it was also the catalyst for everything good that followed. If Pat had just welcomed me to the neighborhood instead of threatening me, she might still be embezzling money and making everyone miserable. One of my favorite moments came about 3 years after everything started. A new family moved in down the street, and they painted their house a gorgeous shade of turquoise. Instead of violation notices, they got welcome baskets and offers to help them settle in. That's when I knew we had really changed the culture of Sunset Hills. It wasn't about the color of the houses. It was never about the color of the houses. It was about treating people with respect, building community instead of enforcing conformity, and standing up when something is wrong. My purple mailbox still stands at the end of my driveway, slightly faded now from the Arizona sun, but still vibrant. People sometimes stop to take pictures with it, especially after the story got picked up by local news and went semi-viral on social media. I got interview requests and invitations to speak at HOA reform conferences. I did a few of them, sharing the story and encouraging people to read their HOA documents, get involved in their communities, and not be afraid to question authority when something doesn't seem right. Mostly, though, I just lived my life. Deanna and I talked about starting a family. We planned trips and hosted barbecues and went to neighborhood movie nights in the park. We lived in our purple houses and were happy. The legal system, slow as it was, eventually processed all the restitution payments. The HOA got back most of the stolen money, which was used to lower dues for everyone for a year and make improvements to the common areas. A small portion was donated to a charity that helped victims of financial fraud, which seemed appropriate. Pat got out of prison after serving 3 years of her 5-year sentence. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she moved to Nevada to live with her sister. I hope she found peace and learned from her mistakes. I don't wish her ill, even though she caused a lot of problems. People can change if they want to. Looking back on the whole experience, I learned a lot about community, justice, and the importance of questioning authority. I learned that sometimes the right thing to do is also the hard thing to do, and that standing up for yourself can inspire others to stand up too. I also learned that paint colors are just paint colors. They don't define a community or its values. What defines a community is how people treat each other, whether they're willing to help their neighbors, and whether they stand up when they see something wrong. 5 years after I first painted my mailbox purple, the neighborhood held a community meeting to discuss updating the HOA guidelines again. They wanted to simplify them even further, removing outdated rules and making the whole document more user-friendly. During the discussion, someone suggested we should have a rule requiring all new board members to visit my house and hear the story of how the current guidelines came to be. It was half joking, but Rachel said she actually thought it was a good idea, maybe not as a requirement but as a tradition. We need to remember why these changes were made, she said. We need to remember what happens when HOAs become more about power than community. They didn't make it an official requirement, but it did become an informal tradition. New board members would come by. I'd tell the story, and we'd talk about the responsibility that comes with having authority over other people's homes and lives. My grandmother's purple mailbox tribute had turned into a teaching moment about governance, community, and the importance of questioning unjust rules. She would have found that hilarious and perfect. Diana gave birth to our daughter on a warm spring morning. We named her Violet, partly for the color and partly because Deanna's grandmother was named Violet, and we wanted to honor both of our grandmothers. When we brought her home from the hospital, the neighborhood had decorated both our houses with purple ribbons and flowers. As I carried my daughter into our purple house, I thought about how much had changed since I first moved to Gilbert. I had been looking for a quiet place to settle down, and instead, I found a community worth fighting for, a cause worth standing up for, and a family worth everything. The purple mailbox stood at the end of the driveway, welcoming us home. It was just a mailbox, a simple metal box painted an unconventional color, but it represented so much more. It represented standing up for what you believe in, even when it seems small or silly. It represented questioning authority when authority is wrong. It represented the idea that sometimes one person really can make a difference. Years passed, and the story of the Purple House became part of the neighborhood's identity. Kids growing up in Sunset Hills knew the story. New residents heard about it when they moved in, and it became a source of pride for the community. We weren't just another HOA neighborhood. We were the neighborhood that stood up to corruption and built something better. I'm writing this now, 10 years after I first installed that purple mailbox, sitting on my porch watching Violet play in the yard. The house has needed repainting a couple times, and each time we've chosen that same shade of desert twilight purple. It's our color now, part of our family identity. The neighborhood is thriving. Property values are strong, people are happy, and the HOA actually functions the way it's supposed to, providing services and maintaining common areas without tyrannizing the residents. Rachel served 2 terms as president before stepping down to spend more time with her grandchildren. George took over after her, and he's doing a great job. The guidelines have been updated several times, always with full community input and transparency. They're simple now, focused on maintaining property values through upkeep rather than enforcing aesthetic conformity. People can paint their houses whatever color they want, as long as it's not offensive or deliberately ugly. Nobody has tested the limits of that rule because people generally want their homes to look nice. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had just changed the mailbox that first day. Would Pat have continued embezzling for years? Would the neighborhood still be living under her rigid control? Would I have met Deanna, who moved to the neighborhood specifically because she heard about the HOA reforms? I guess I'll never know, and that's okay. What matters is what did happen, the choices I made, and the community that resulted from those choices. My purple mailbox gets mail every day, just like every other mailbox in America. But it also gets occasional notes from neighbors saying thanks, or letters from people in other HOA communities asking for advice on dealing with their own overbearing boards. I try to respond when I can, sharing what I learned and encouraging people to get involved in their communities. The story of the Purple House has been written about in legal journals as a case study in HOA fraud detection and community accountability. It's been featured in articles about homeowner rights and HOA reform. Deanna even wrote a book about it with my blessing, using our experience as a framework for discussing better HOA governance practices. But mostly, it's just a house. A purple house where a family lives, where a little girl plays, where friends gather for barbecues and holidays. A house in a neighborhood where people look out for each other and work together to build something good. That's what it was always supposed to be about. Not the color, not the rules, not the power struggles. Just community, connection, and home. I look at Violet, who's now carefully arranging her toy cars in rainbow order on the driveway, purple ones first, and I think about what lessons she'll learn growing up in this house, in this neighborhood. She'll learn that sometimes you have to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. She'll learn that communities are built by people who care enough to get involved. She'll learn that sometimes change starts with something small, like a mailbox, and she'll learn that purple is a perfectly acceptable earth tone. Thank you very much.